There's probably nothing more harrowing for a family than when one of their loved ones just up and disappears off the face of the earth, leaving no indication as to why it happened and whether the person in question had any say in the matter or not. Not to be too callous here, but at least with loved ones who've passed, whether it be through someone's evil actions, natural causes, or disease, there's at least a sense of closure in knowing exactly what happened to your family and having some place to grieve for them from time to time. Not so much with a missing person, where friends and family will literally search their entire lives, hoping and praying for any scrap of information that can lead them to figuring out exactly what happened to their loved one. Our story today is one such case, and it still remains unsolved to this day. In fact, it's one of Michigan's longest-running unsolved mysteries. It's time to go over the case file of Paige Renkoski. I'm your host, Kevin, and this is Crime Chronicle. Today we swing over to my place of work, Okemos, Michigan. Down off Marsh Road lies Okemos High School. People like Tom Welling, best known for his portrayal of Clark Kent in the TV hit Smallville, YouTuber Tyler Oakley, and John Bennett Ramsey, the father of Jean-Benet Ramsey, who I may do a video on in the future, have all passed through these halls at one time or another. It really is a strange thought knowing Superman was studying algebra less than a mile from where I do my menial labor. Back to the true subject of our tale though. Paige Renkoski was a substitute school teacher for DeWitt Township, Michigan, while actually living nearby in Okemos. She was born in my hometown of Lansing, Michigan, February 2nd of 1960 to loving parents Carl and Ardis Renkoski, also having three sisters, Tamara Ann, Cheryl Lee, and Michelle Lynette. Paige was attending college to earn a degree in early childhood development while working as a preschool aide to put herself through those classes. Those that knew her described her as driven and hardworking, always in good humor, and she was very much appreciated in her workplace and school. Her life seemed to be going exactly in the direction she wanted as she was approaching her education goals to further her career and was also engaged to a man named Steve DeBrander, with their wedding set for November of 1990. That's exactly why what happened is all the more tragic. May 24th, 1990 seemed like any ordinary day. Spring had come by this point, and even though the clouds dotted the sky, there was still plenty of sun to warm the air. Paige dropped her mother off at the Detroit Metropolitan Airport at around 11:30 a.m. She wasn't finished with her plans just yet, as she then went to visit a nearby friend that just had a baby who lived in Canton Township. She was next seen at a store off of Interstate 275 where she purchased beer, somewhere between 2:30 and 2:45 p.m. Now, here's where things become somewhat odd. At around 3:30 p.m., Paige had pulled over and parked on the shoulder of Interstate 96, about half a mile away from the Fowlerville exit. It was here that eyewitnesses say she was interacting with two men that had also pulled onto the shoulder. According to the witnesses, Paige seemed rather animated and distressed, commenting that it appeared one of the men had put his arm on her shoulder to comfort her. Some of the witnesses even say there was a third man that either stayed inside the burgundy minivan they were described as having, or was standing just outside of it. These witnesses would be the last people to see Paige Renkoski ever again. A motorist that had passed by Paige in her vehicle at around 3:30 p.m. was making his return trip around 7:30 p.m. and noticed that Paige's car was still there on the side of the freeway, and informed local authorities about it. The Oldsmobile Cutlass was still idling on the side of the road, Paige's keys still in the ignition, the lights and radio still on. Paige's purse, wallet, and shoes were still in the vehicle, as well as a partially drunk bottle of beer that she had purchased earlier. The responding officer considered the car an abandoned vehicle, so unfortunately it was not processed as a crime scene as it should have been, and instead it was processed after it had already been towed and moved away from the scene of the crime. Upon realization that the vehicle was not abandoned and was now part of a missing persons investigation, police quickly got to work discovering what forensic evidence may have been left behind by potential abductors. Fingerprints and palm prints were pulled from the vehicle. To this day, however, no matches for any of them have been found. It was reported that shortly before her disappearance, Paige and her fiancé were having problems. Naturally, detectives wanted to check this angle out. Ultimately, though, this ended up ruling out the fiancé as a suspect. Beyond a few composite sketches of what the suspects may look like, investigators were left puzzled by what happened. Paige had seemingly just vanished without a trace, and no further clues in the case would turn up for quite a long time. Even with the thousands of tips that had poured in due to the posting of billboards, news articles, and a Crime Stoppers report to get Paige's story and face out to the public, the case would still collect dust on a shelf for years at a time, and was quickly considered a cold case. The case was reopened in the 90s when new eyes fell upon it, and they quickly retraced the steps of previous investigators with new insight, as well as a few new tips. In 2002, police reported that 2 suspects had been identified, one of which would have been just 17 at the time of the disappearance, and the other having died in prison a few years prior. However, it wasn't until 2009 when some real movement on the case began. Police reported they had 6 suspects in connection with Paige Renkoski's disappearance, including the 2 identified in 2002. In 2011, after reviewing the 1999 case file, investigators, in collaboration with both the FBI and MSU, began digging at a property on Sober Road in Conway Township. Previously, cadaver dogs had detected human remains at the private property. They were led to the area by a letter and a hand-drawn map which denoted Paige Renkoski's remains are located here. For something so blatantly and plainly labeled, I would have imagined that this would have set something in motion much sooner. And unfortunately, as heavily as I've dug into it, I have not found any more clarification on that matter. It is something I am intensely curious about and have a need to know more. Unfortunately, every time I dig into it, it just leads me back to another dead end. So, just to sate my curiosity, if anybody has any more information on this letter and map, please do share, because I need to know. No other information is provided anywhere that I can find. Hi, this is your host in the editing room in the future. While I was editing this episode, I happened to stumble upon another mention of the letter and map that I was very, very interested in hearing more about. Here it claims that the timeline for that is actually right around late 1990 to early 1991. Roughly 6 months after Paige disappeared, investigators receive a letter from an anonymous source. The letter has a map enclosed and indicates that the information may be a red herring. It's quoted here, "However, I have recently come into some information about Paige that may or may not be true. I have tried to verify as much of this information as I could and have found many of the details to be true," unquote. The source declares that the map is the supposed route taken by her abductors. The unsigned letter ends with, "Thank you for your attention to this." So this letter and map were put in a case file years later in 1999, which is where I originally picked it up from the timeline, and again revisited in 2011, when authorities suspected the map may have been initially read incorrectly by investigators. Okay, that answers actually one of the major questions I had about that. So the letter was another anonymous tip. It didn't just materialize out of nowhere. So at least there's that. Apparently investigators did actually visit the location from the map. However, later investigators kind of suspected that they might have read it wrong and visited the wrong location after all. Well, at least that's one mystery solved. Alrighty, so that was it from me from the future. Back to you, me from the past. And I need to know. In December of 2017, the mother of Paige Renkoski, Ardis Renkoski, passed away after going through rehabilitation for a fall she had taken at her home that left her paralyzed. It was her wish that if Paige had not been recovered before her death, that her family have a dual memorial for both Paige and herself. After Paige disappeared, Ardis became an advocate for families of the missing and the investigators searching for them. She would often champion those investigators. However, she was also very certain that she would never see Paige alive again, never believing or drowning in false hope. Her fastidious advocacy for the families of the missing, as well as the respect she had earned from law enforcement, resulted in the establishment of the Ardis Renkoski Advocacy Award, which naturally she was the first recipient of. Paige's father, Carl Daniel Renkoski, passed in 1994, so Ardis is survived by her 3 remaining daughters. Even after all these years, the question remains: what happened to Paige Renkoski? Where is she, and why did she disappear? There doesn't appear to be any concrete answers, though investigators are certain that wherever Paige is, she is no longer among the living. Just prior to her disappearance, Paige had deposited a large sum of money into her bank account. It remained completely untouched after she vanished, so we're all fairly certain money was not a factor in her disappearance. Throughout the decade, right up to her disappearance, 3 other disappearances and murders also occurred in the general area of where Paige disappeared. It's possible that the same someone or someones responsible for those had also taken Paige. Around the time, a number of individuals were going around and harassing motorists with fake police badges impersonating officers. It is entirely possible that one such person saw Paige and decided to do more than just shake her down. Her father did work in law enforcement, so if this person flashed their badge to her, it is likely that she would have pulled over due to the immense respect she held for the badge. Another, yet very unlikely theory that's been floated around claims that Paige had been followed for some time by someone with a vendetta against her or her fiancé, determined to act out their ill desires on her that day. Though this theory is highly unlikely, since they would have basically had to follow her from Okemos over an hour to the airport, then to a girlfriend's residence, and finally heading back. This final theory concerns the investigators when they went to go check the hand-drawn map and letter when they originally got it in the early 90s. It is entirely possible that their original investigation was close enough to where Paige's remains were actually located that it could have spooked whoever was responsible for her disappearance. And again, this is just my theory based on what I'm looking at. You know, it stands to reason that if the cadaver dogs at a later point did find evidence that human remains were there, even though none were apparently recovered, that she may have been in that location, and having the investigators get so close to her without finding her, it just ended up freaking out whoever actually was responsible for her disappearance, and they likely would have moved her to another location, which would actually explain why the cadaver dogs were able to pick up traces of human remains without actually locating any human remains. But again, that's just my theory. Now, I am actually, even though it's my theory, I'm not actually a big fan of it, since it would also then imply that whoever was responsible would have consistent access over the years to that site, and that just does not seem likely to me at all. Over the years, literal thousands of tips have been given to investigators, and yet we still seem no closer to bringing Paige home. We can only hope that someone will finally come forward with that missing piece to give her family the closure they deserve. Thank you for watching Crime Chronicle. I post videos currently every month, though I'm hoping I can transition to bi-weekly here soon. If you appreciate what I do here, then please hit that like button. If you're interested in future content from this channel, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to hit that bell to stay notified on all future uploads. Once again, I've been your host, Kevin. This has been Crime Chronicle, and you stay safe out there.